Sim racing, as in real-world motorsport, is a little bit of a capricious mistress. Despite all of the advances that we have had, particularly in times of late, in terms of the fidelity of the simulation programs themselves, be it Assetto Corsa or iRacing or Assetto Corsa Competizione, the state-of-the-art of sim racing is always evolving. However, as in the world of real motorsport, fortunes can be varied. And for a time, in the beginning part of 2020, obviously the world being a very different place now than it was at the start of this year, how we wish we could go back to those times of normalcy in January, not all that long ago, things came to a halt in terms of innovation and developments for Assetto Corsa in a large scale. Of course, that's not to say that development stopped entirely. Assetto Corsa has one of the most vibrant and active mod communities in all of sim racing. It very much reminds me of the wonderfully vibrant community that R-Factor 1 inspired some 15 years ago and still maintains to some extent even today. However, all of that came to a very welcome halt on the 20th of September this year, when RaceSim Studio, one of the greatest names in sim racing modding ever, and certainly the greatest ever developer for Assetto Corsa, released this. This is, of course, RaceSim Studio's latest open-wheel release for Assetto Corsa RSS Formula 1990 V12. It is, of course, a recreation of a real-world car, and it is also, in my opinion, one of the most highly anticipated releases that I have ever known about, that I have ever followed throughout most of its gestation period, and, to a small extent anyway, the first one that I have actually been involved with. It is, of course, a recreation of a very real-world car, and one of the most spectacularly beautiful, and one of the most spectacularly innovative at that. As a veteran sim racer myself, I do very much understand what it takes to get behind the wheel of a vast variety of different types of cars that are designed to emulate different eras and different series with all different hosts of performance envelopes and overall potential to deliver their goods to you. And this one is no exception to that. It is, most likely, the most engaging, rewarding, altogether thrilling driving experience that I have ever had in Assetto Corsa, and, for that matter, definitely one of the top 5, if not top 3, that I have ever had in sim racing, full stop, after 21 years of being involved in this hobby. And having been involved in this hobby for so long, I have had the chance to sample a menagerie of different sims, some good, some not so good, some aging gracefully and others all but forgotten. However, Assetto Corsa is unique in that regard. This game is nigh on 7 years old, and it continues to receive active development largely for free, or at very low cost, effectively for free for most of us, from a team and a community of highly skilled developers, many of whom actually work professionally in game design and graphic design and sound design and all kinds of things that are related either directly or tangentially to video game and computer software development. Assetto Corsa itself is a testament to this hobby and how many people are absolutely in love with it and how many people remain involved with it to this day, some of whom for even longer than I have, even though I'm now much more experienced in terms of sim racing than some of you listening to the sound of my voice right now are experienced in life on Earth. That's something rather humbling to me. And I must say that my remarks earlier about perhaps some of this getting a little bit stale, well, it's true. I have gotten the chance, virtually at least, to drive hundreds of different cars representing all kinds of different series and historical eras coming from every manufacturer you could think of. But there was always one that eluded me. Whether it was R-Factor or R-Factor 2 or iRacing or even Assetto Corsa, there was one type of car one car in particular that I really wanted to get, and that, really, we never were given. Of course, we had approximations of this car for years, going back to 2008, I can remember, at very least. Perhaps it was even earlier. There were modifications for R-Factor 1 representing this era of Formula 1. There were even mods that were entitled with the proper real-world name of this car. And yet, they all just missed the mark, in my opinion. The physics were a little bit off, or the sounds perhaps weren't quite right, or just in general, something was unsatisfying about them. However, now, for the first time, and probably the only time in however long my sim racing tenure ends up being, that wrong has been put right. The real-world analog and inspiration for this car comes to us from a company that has been involved in Formula 1 since it became an official world championship all the way back in 1950. It comes to us from a company that is the most successful in Grand Prix racing history. It comes to us from an organization that not only represents excellence in motorsport, but one that also represents the spirit of an entire nation, and one that excites the passions of billions of people around the world. It is fitting, then, that the one organization, the one company, the one group of people who would have any chance of recreating such a machine to the fidelity required in order to do it justice, not only in terms of its macrocosmic and external and internal and sonorous qualities, and recreating that in fine detail, but in terms of capturing what this car represents, not only to aficionados of motorsport, not only to pay proper tribute to the spirit of the nation that this company and thereby this car represents, but also to pay tribute to just how important and how special this car truly was, in that it dictated the design direction for all Grand Prix race cars that followed it. Race Sim Studio, of course, were the only ones who could have risen to that challenge, and they are absolute masters in execution. And boy, have they executed here. It is, in a word, spellbinding. It is among the most challenging, frightful, but at the same time, absolutely enjoyable, rewarding, and even now, with all of my experience in sim racing anyway, instructional experiences that I have ever had behind the virtual wheel. And, did I mention, it's got a V12 in the back. Greetings all, Ferrari 601 here. Yes, here it is, in the flesh, or in the virtual flesh anyway, Race Sim Studios RSS Formula 1990 V12. Yeah, that was a 9-minute introduction. I sincerely apologize for that. But here we are in the showroom, and, well, we have got ourselves something that is absolutely incredible to behold. Racing Studio, in particular, their lead modeler, who goes by the name of CC on Race Department as well as on the RSS Discord, he's a bit of a fanatic for detail. Yes, you can very clearly see that immediately upon initial inspection of this model, and of course, as we get closer in to take a look at some individual details, you're really going to see why this thing ended up having, according to Content Manager, 431,780 individual polygons, comprising 186 total objects. Yeah. What is this project, though? RSS Formula 90 V12. It is the culmination of about 18 months of work on the part of Racing Studio. I remember talking to the Racing Studio guys in, I want to say, very late 2018, right around the same time of the release of RSS Formula 2000 V10, which was also one of those landmark Halo sort of projects for Racing Studio, one in which they said, you know what, let's just be as absolutely fastidious as possible and make something that is as close to perfection as we can possibly make it, given the tools available to us right now. That car was absolutely immaculate, and it still is absolutely immaculate, and you can consider Formula 90 to be not necessarily a successor to Formula 2000 V10, but a stablemate for sure. It is definitely made along the same lines of attention to detail and a desire to emulate the real-world subject matter as closely as is absolutely possible, given the availability of data and photographs and things to the public, although as cars get older, and as modding teams try to emulate these older and older cars, source material becomes more and more scarce. And it does mean that sometimes there are gaps that need to be filled. And sometimes those gaps can be rather large. We'll get into that a little bit, I am sure. However, per Content Manager, the nuts and bolts of what this car is and what it brings available to us. We've got 680 horsepower out of a V12 engine in the back. The overall chassis weight, though, including the driver, 503 kilograms. That means that we do have 0.74 kilograms per horsepower, which of course is a greater than 1-to-1 power-to-weight ratio. That allows a 0 to 100 km/h acceleration time of about 3 seconds, depending on how you've got the car set up, what tires are on board, and of course, how you are managing the throttle. We've got a lot of performance potential available here. So much so that in testing that I have done, and in collaboration with Racing Studio in terms of trying to discuss the performance parameters of this car with the guys who actually built it, it is very comparable on a consistent basis in terms of overall performance to RSS Formula 2000 V10, itself a car modeled after a real-world one, but 10 years newer than this one. Although built to two very different sets of regulations, you would still expect a car that's 10 years newer to be faster. Not always the case, ladies and gentlemen. This thing, although it is 30 years old in terms of its real subject matter, it's got a lot of performance, it's got big wings, of course it's got a flat bottom as well, which means a whole lot more aerodynamic efficiency, it's wider, it's got slick tires, and of course it's about 100 kilograms lighter. So despite being at about 130 horsepower disadvantage to the 2000 era car, it's still just as quick, if not a little bit quicker, depending on the running conditions and the specific circuit that you happen to be on. The car's real-world subject matter, though, we've beaten around this bush for long enough. Those of you who are Formula 1 fans, you know absolutely what this car is. It is the Ferrari 641 Formula 1 car of the 1990 season. Driven by Alain Prost and Nigel Mansell, the car came within a whisker of winning the World Championship in 1990. That campaign was cut short by one Ayrton Senna, and one McLaren MP45B, and one going for a gap that didn't exist. Yes, of course, the 1990 Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka. Senna went into a disappearing wedge, in the words of Martin Brundle, and he took the rear end off of Alain Prost's Ferrari 641. He took the front end off of his own McLaren MP45B. Both gentlemen ended up in the gravel, and Ayrton Senna became world champion of 1990. However, that championship campaign on the part of Ferrari was not one that was built on luck. No, the 641 was a car that was built on a lot of science and a lot of innovation and a lot of technical firsts as far as the Formula One World Championship was concerned. What we do need to do, though, in terms of talking about the 641, is turn the clock back 1 year further and talk about the Ferrari 640 of the 1989 World Championship season. 1989, not a great year for Ferrari. It was another year of the McLaren teammates battling it out between each other. At the time, you had Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna at the same team. Of course, this came to a head at Suzuka that year when both men collided at the Casio Triangle at the later stages of the race. Prost retired, Senna continued, he won the race on track, he was later given a disqualification, giving the win to Alessandro Nannini. However, what was Ferrari doing? Well, they were designing the semi-automatic gearbox. Ferrari 640, it was the first Formula One car to feature the semi-automatic gearbox, and this car, its immediate successor, also featured a semi-automatic gearbox, as you can see here, recreated very nicely by Race Sim Studio. Now, this particular car, not the first to feature the technology, that honor goes to its immediate predecessor, but what was it and why were they doing it? Well, effectively, there was nothing wrong with the conventional H-pattern manual gearboxes that Formula One cars had in this era, and aside from the Ferraris, everybody was running an H-pattern manual in 1990 as well. But seeing the writing on the wall in terms of not being able strictly to rely upon engine power to get an advantage over your rivals, aerodynamics started to become more and more and more of a pertinent factor in terms of designing a competitive race car. Knowing this, Ferrari, who once, Mr. Ferrari, said that aerodynamics were for people who couldn't build engines, Ferrari, as a company, decided, well, you know what, we need to start getting better at this aerodynamics thing because these engines are just not going to be powerful enough for much longer. So, Ferrari in 1989, what do? They hire John Barnard, yes, the legendary race car designer who has had fame with teams like McLaren and, of course, Ferrari. And they hire him and say, look, we need to get good at this aerodynamics thing. How can we do this? Well, John Barnard says, well, we can make the cockpit area a bit narrower so we can take more advantage of expanding the bodywork around the side pods and the floor, and perhaps we could get ourselves a little bit more downforce through the undertray that way. That ground effect thing, well, it's not totally dead. We've got a flat bottom on the car. We can't seal the floor with skirts, but we could get pretty close if we could lower the ride height enough and narrow down all the areas that don't strictly need to be as wide as possible. So Ferrari say, okay, well, I think we're doing a pretty good job with designing our cars to begin with. What do you suggest? Barnard says, let's make the cockpit narrower. But we need to change gear. We need a lever there on one side or another, usually on the right side. I mean, how could we possibly move that? John Barnard says, well, take the gear lever away. Huh? Well, in order to try and get as much aerodynamic efficiency as possible in terms of reducing the car's cross-sectional area laterally, John Barnard completely redesigns the transmission in the car. He does not remain running a 6-speed or some cases even 5-speed manual H-pattern gearbox. Instead, he designs a completely new mechanism and a completely new type of gearbox in order to address this aerodynamic problem, and it became known as the semi-automatic sequential gearbox. This car features a 7-speed semi-automatic sequential gearbox, and semi-automatic to the extent of there is no gear lever per se. The driver does manually select gears, but they're only selected sequentially, so in order to get up to top gear, you need to go through all of the gears in sequence, and similarly, in terms of going back down into first gear or neutral or to reverse, you need to go back down through all of the gears sequentially. That's a sequential gearbox in a nutshell. However, the semi-automatic part comes in where we do not have a driver-operable clutch in terms of affecting the gear changes at speed on track. There is still a clutch pedal in the car, and it is necessary for the driver to use it when they are starting and stopping or driving at lower speeds than absolutely 100% flat out. But under normal circumstances, a gear change in a transmission like this, in a car equipped with a transmission like this, is just a flick of the fingers on the right-hand backside of the steering wheel to shift up by one gear, and then another complementary flick of the fingers on the left side of the steering wheel to go back down. There is no manipulation of the throttle or clutch required in order to effect those gear changes because the mechanism inside the gearbox is fast enough to swap cogs without really the engine noticing too much that the ratio is in the middle of being changed. Obviously, the revs will rise and fall accordingly, but it's fast enough to where the driver doesn't really need to give any other input other than just flicking his fingers to flip that lever on the back of the steering wheel. Now, of course, I know that all of you know full well what a semi-automatic gearbox does in the context of Formula One, but this was the first time that it happened. 1989 was the first time that it happened, and 1990 with the 641 was the first time that it was truly implemented successfully. In 1989, the 640 came out and debuted this technology in a race weekend in Formula One. It won its first race, but then they struggled for the rest of the year. So clearly, with some new technology, there were going to be teething problems. Ferrari took 1989 as a bit of a test year, and they took the winter of 1989 into 1990 to really hone and refine their design and put it into the 641. And it culminated in, out of 16 races entered, the car won 6 of them. It took 3 pole positions and 5 fastest laps. As we said, it was not good enough to win the Drivers' or Constructors' Championship of 1990, but it did come mighty close, and Alain Prost probably would have won the Drivers' Championship had Ayrton Senna not had a gap that disappeared. However, what else do we have here? Obviously, we've got that semi-automatic gearbox, a huge innovation, and it is the innovation that every single Formula One car to follow has implemented in its own design. Of course, other teams were a little bit slower to adopt this technology in terms of how quickly they could develop it, but Williams in 1991, they had it. McLaren in 1992, eventually they had it. The other guys who were coming to the fore on the grid, Benetton, they had it by 1993, and they also had active suspension and whatnot. The last manual gearbox in terms of an H-pattern traditional manual transmission in Formula One was the Forti team all the way in 1996, believe it or not. And of course, this was a team that was always at the back of the grid. They had a shoestring budget, and it was not uncommon for them not even to qualify for races, but they were the last ones who were running basically a 10-year-old design by that point, who ran a manual gearbox in Formula One. Anybody else who mattered, they had the semi-automatic paddle shift transmission by 1994 at absolute latest. But absolutely remarkable that a car like this, even though it didn't win the World Championship, it came mighty close, it became the design benchmark in terms of how Formula One drivetrains work. Other things that you can see on this car, though, you can see this absolutely classic Coke bottle shape across the longitudinal axis of the car, and as things start to get a little bit tighter toward the rear end, you can also see that we have got all that free floor space toward the rear. That's also something that Formula One cars started to emulate. And this not necessarily was the first to do that in terms of the overall bodywork layout, but it was one of the more distinctive designs that implemented a solution like that. And you can see that freeing up that floor space allows more topside diffuser flow, and then of course that can be complementary to a high degree of the bottom side diffuser flow, which was very important in this era as well, because unlike modern cars, and by modern cars I mean after 1994, this car has a flat bottom. Of course, nowadays we see the undersides of Formula One cars, they have what's called a step plane in the floor. They have got a reference plane, which is the outboard side of the floor going all the way to the edge of the car. And then they have a step plane of about 50 millimeters, and then there is a centerline plank that runs down the middle of the car longitudinally. It used to be an actual wooden board that was used to enforce wear rates of that plank, and therefore to police ride height that way. Now it's a composite material, but before 1994, and really after 1983 or so, after the outright banning of skirts to create ground effect that way, there was no plank. So, this means that you have a flat bottom. And of course, if you have no plank on this car, you can have a lot more efficient downforce because you have a lot more laminar of a flow. There's not as much turbulence going on here in the under tray, which means that everything is more uniform. You can get the air funneled toward the rear end and then out the diffuser, as you can see, more or less conventional, even in a contemporary sense, diffuser strakes coming out from the top side of the floor, extending toward the ground. You get a lot of downforce this way. So this car, believe it or not, has more downforce than a 1995 car about, and it definitely has about the same, if not a little bit more downforce than even a car of the year 2000. So that was a big deal. Those 1995 regulations in Formula One, they were designed to slow the cars down, and they really, really did after 1997, with making the cars more narrow in terms of going from a 2,000 millimeter track to an 1,800 millimeter track, adding grooved tires rather than slicks. The cars slowed down even further, and of course the minimum weight has been creeping up for about 30 years as well. So, believe it or not, this car, despite being from 1990, is really still comparable to cars from 2000, 2001 in terms of the overall performance potential. Of course, beyond 2001, we started to get into the realm of electronic trickery in terms of traction control and yaw control and things like that, and then that's when the performance really explodes relative to something like this. But this, still more or less an analog car, still using a throttle cable rather than potentiometers and actuators. You've got yourself a lot of performance potential here. It's still comparable in the modern era to Formula 2 levels of performance. It's really something spectacular, and it's really something pretty serious in terms of the overall performance potential available. At any rate, enough of talking about the historical significance of this car. As a mod for Assetto Corsa, Race Sim Studio, of course, they always pull out all the stops, especially when they're working on a project like this. What have they given us here? From a modeling standpoint, as we mentioned, this thing has 431,780 polygons in the model, 186 total objects. It has been about an 18-month labor of love for Race Sim Studio putting this thing together. Just looking at the 3D model on this thing, we can get into Freecam here and we can really start to get in close. First of all, of course, there is our Race Sim Studio logo, the same logo that we saw on RSS Formula 2000 V10, but of course updated appropriately for this particular version of their Halo Project car here. It's a V12 Formula 1 car. It's something that we've really been missing in Assetto Corsa, and it's something that I think Race Sim Studio were missing in their portfolio. They have it now, and they've really executed very well indeed. Have a look at this, getting in all that close to the nose. There's effectively no pixelation of anything. All of the lines are crisp and clean. That's wonderful stuff to see, and of course you can see the reflections starting to go on through the nose there. You can also notice that these reflections are a little bit mottled. They are not super crisp, they're not super sharp. You can see some distortion there. Is that an error? No, absolutely it is not an error. This car, of course, has a full carbon composite structure in terms of the bodywork and the chassis. And carbon fiber, if you've never seen it up close, it is not this silky smooth material that perhaps you're led to believe it is. It's actually a bit ratty when you look at it up close and personal. There are jagged lines in it. There are very rough cuts at different shut lines in the bodywork, which is why you often see the teams actually taping the body panels together after they've been bolted onto the car in order to cut down on any aerodynamic turbulence that would be induced by those ragged lines around the shut lines of the car. So carbon fiber is not silky smooth. It's a bit rough, and therefore when you get optical reflections through it, those reflections are going to reflect the surface characteristics of this material, and you would expect those reflections to be a bit mottled in their appearance, just as they are here. That is absolutely remarkable to see that Race Sim Studio have bothered to pay that close attention to these details. Another great detail that you're going to see here, speaking of the carbon layup, you can see, generally speaking, that you've got this roughly, not perpendicular, but coming down about 45 or so degrees relative to the leading edge of the wing. You can see just all the striations in the carbon structure. They are really canted over, again, about 45 degrees relative to perpendicular to our eye point. What's this all about? That's trying to emulate the layup of the carbon material that went into the initial mock-up of this component before it was all impregnated with resin and put in the autoclave to cure into its final shape. And Ferrari, in terms of their wing design, they must have done this to try and combat flexing that would be induced through the structure of the wing as the download comes on with the aerodynamic forces as the car gains speed. That is absolutely remarkable to see that as well. Other little details across the front wing. You can see the end fences here with the little vortex generators underneath. There you go. A little bit different from the vortex generators that we see nowadays, but you can see it here. And you can also see that we actually have wood bonded to the bottom of the wing structure. This is part of the wing that's designed to wear away because, of course, no refueling in the races in this era. These cars would have very low ride height at the start of the race, and the front wing end fences would actually trail along the ground. Very similar to the sliding skirts of the 1980s, but this was something that was designed to be a sacrificial part, and you can see that it is a wood laminate material. Wood is pretty light, all things considered, in terms of the amount of structural rigidity that it can offer, and of course this would just be a sacrificial material to be worn away on the track surface as the wing was skating across the ground right at the beginning of the Grand Prix. That's also one of the reasons why you see a lot of sparks and things coming from the front ends of cars like these. Those front wings were dragging on the ground. So, again, sacrificial part there. The outboard sides of the end fences, you can see that these are in carbon, and we have got our little flap adjuster holes here. The little bolt heads are modeled, and you can see the different holes here for having the flap angle change on that front wing. That's pretty remarkable. Moving rearward, you have our suspension arrangement, double wishbone pushrod, as we still see on the front ends of Formula One cars today, but because this car has a bit of a wider stance, a wider track than the modern ones, or perhaps it's about the same, but definitely it's wider than it would have been in 1998 per se. But you can see double wishbone pushrod, the control arms there, the upper and lower wishbones, though, being a bit wider than perhaps you'd be expecting today. There is our left front wheel, the wheel hub and brake disc, the brake duct there for cooling the brake disc. Going back into this area, there we go. See, inside the brake duct, they have model geometries inside there, and then, of course, there it vents into the wheel hub to cool the brake and to cool the wheel hub a little bit. Outboard side of the left front wheel, there it is. Torque Speed. Resim Studio have decided to brand these wheels in their generic skins here. Wheel nut. There is the facing surface of the brake disc. Very cool, and you can see some carbon fiber reinforcement going on in the wheel structure itself, and of course the principal structure of the wheel is all magnesium. Tires, very nicely modeled here. We have got embossed lettering, radial. We have got made in the UK by Resim Studio Limited. There we go. Chalk marks across the outer face of the tire there, and even some chalk marks here on the tread surface of the tire. F-Man. Wonder who that possibly could be. Anyway, moving up toward the cockpit area, this bodywork, very much a departure from what we see today. It's all flat and it's all smooth. No flow modifiers, chimneys, turning vanes, anything like that. No barge boards across the center section of the lower side of the monocoque. None of that really had been invented yet. Just very smooth, uninterrupted, clean body lines, all designed to funnel air toward the rear. Top side, we've got a rear wing, obviously, quite a large wing, and pretty good at generating topside downforce, but still on this car, the majority of the grip coming from the under tray, and you can see what they're trying to do here in terms of treating the under tray with some smooth bodywork here. You've got this open triangular section of the floor, still very much reminiscent of what we see today. When you've got all this space to play with, it means that you can feed the diffuser, and you can see generally the trajectory of the air as it would come out of the diffuser. This is a little strut to help support the rear wing, and then you've got this gurney flap right at the top of the diffuser, and that, of course, is just designed to create a little bit more downforce just before it exits the rear of the car at rather high velocity. The underside of the car, it's very low, but you can see that we have a flat bottom through and through on this car. No reference plane, no plank, no nothing. That is just funneling air at high pressure underneath, and then it slows down and expands out the back, which means that you get a lot of downforce, a partial vacuum really, out of the diffuser, and then as it vents back to atmosphere, that has an equal and opposite reaction of sucking the car down to the road. Aiding the airflow in so doing that, we have got ourselves exhaust outlets. Of course, this is a 3.5 liter V12, which means that we've got two banks of 6 cylinders, which means that we have got two exhaust outlets principally on the car, and they come out through the diffuser. So, 1990, this is a blown diffuser, ladies and gentlemen. They were not something that was designed and invented, really, in 2011 by Adrian Newey and Red Bull. No. blown diffusers have been around since time began for the most part. The distinction in the 2011 cars, though, was that some teams figured out how to blow the diffuser off throttle, meaning that they could manipulate their ECU, their electronic control unit parameters, to keep the throttles on the engine open so that the engine is acting as an air pump, but they could then cut the spark or cut the fuel delivery to cut the engine actually generating any usable power. So the car would still decelerate off throttle, but the throttle valves themselves, the butterflies, would stay open, so the engine, through its momentum of being driven by the rear axle, would continue to pump air through it and, do things like that. But no, blown diffusers, on throttle anyway, were a thing all the way back in 1990 and even before that. So, yes, a blown diffuser on this car, which actually does come into play in terms of how you have to drive this car. Some things that you got to do in it are a little bit different from what you would definitely do in a modern one as it relates to high-speed corners. It's interesting. Moving up toward top side here, you can see that we have got ourselves the cockpit. There we go. All sorts of wonderful bells and whistles in this thing, but one thing that you don't see is a gear lever because, well, of course, this is the semi-automatic gearbox in this car. But there it is. Here's our steering wheel, and I know that over on the RSS Discord, CC was very proud of the work that he did on this steering wheel, and you can see why. We've got ourselves this pseudo-suede look across the steering wheel, and as we pull out a little bit, you can just see the amount of detail that was done here. It really feels, it would feel correct if you could reach out and touch it. That's what I mean there. I almost feel like I could reach out and touch that and understand what that texture would feel like between my fingers. It's remarkable levels of detail going on. Of course, we have got the Racing Studio logo, or one of them, or really two of them here on the steering wheel. And then we've got two switches. We have got a talk switch for the radio, and then we have got this zero switch, I believe, which is going to be an emergency kill for the engine. Because, remember, a throttle cable in this car, so you could, in theory, get a stuck throttle still, even in this era. Dashboard, there it is. We don't have all that much data on this dashboard, but we've got more than you might expect. Obviously, we've got a Rev Counter, and it works in two steps. It's obviously this continuous arc from lower left to upper right, but we have got a lower speed RPM count going down to 2,000 RPM up to 8,000, and then from 8,000 to 14,000, we've got ourselves a secondary section of this that will start to light up and show you what the RPM is doing at the crankshaft. This engine has a red line of about 13,000 RPM. The usable rev range pretty much ends at 12.5, 12.6 or so, but you've got it documented here. That window on the right-hand side of the dash, that's our gear position indicator, and then we're going to have things like position, fuel, lap time, all kinds of things coming up here. So really, you've got some good information on the dashboard there, but notice, still very much a conventional-looking, almost road car-looking steering wheel on this thing. Other things in the cockpit, wonderful switch detail, wonderful dashboard and bulkhead detail with the little screw heads here, the little lights, the brake bias adjuster, this button here with the R on it, that's to select reverse in this semi-automatic transmission. There's a button for neutral, and of course we have got more shift lights up top. That's absolutely great. This switch here, I'm not entirely sure what the function of this switch would have been. It might have been to cycle between different displays on the dash, or it might have been to do something with either the radio system, because the switch is right next to an antenna, so I wonder what that might be. Different radio channels, perhaps. Another antenna here. We've got rain light switches here. We've got a save switch. This is probably a rudimentary data marker system there, in terms of when the drivers would hit the mark switch or the note switch on their modern steering wheels to tell the engineers, hey, something weird happened here, I'm going to mark this on the telemetry, so when you guys see it later, you'll understand that I had a question. Emergency kill switch right here. Then, of course, we've got our steering column. The back side of our steering wheel, something that you'll never see, but here it is. Look at that. There's your quick release mechanism to remove the steering wheel, and then here are the paddles. Look a little bit different from the paddles that we see on contemporary cars, but they are identical in their function, up on the right, down on the left, and you can see how all that works. And of course, all of this is actually animated in real time as you're driving the car too. Absolutely crazy. And not only did RSS do their job in terms of replicating this visually, but they have also taken the time to look at real-world examples of this steering wheel and others like it from this era, and they have deconstructed how the mechanism actually actuated and how it operated. So this is as close as they could have gotten to a one-to-one correspondence with the real thing recreated in the virtual world. And you can even see the little contacts here that the paddles would hit to actuate the switch inside the steering wheel to effect that gear change. Incredible. One of the areas in this cockpit that we had some trouble trying to emulate here in terms of how the detail should be was the pedal box. There were literally hundreds of reference photos that RSS consulted to try and model this car as accurately as possible in comparison to the real thing. And I think they came mighty, mighty close. They did far better a job than I ever thought they could. But one of the things that happened rather early on in the modeling and design phase of this car was Racing Studio reached out to me, and they know that I'm a bit of a fan of Ferrari, and they know that I'm a bit of a fan of V12 Formula One cars. And they reached out to me and asked what I knew about the thing, and any material that I might have about it. While I didn't have any real-world reference photos to speak of, other than what's easily available on Google or Bing or whatever, and whatever image search you want to do, I do have two 1/18th scale models of this car, the 641 Ferrari, and they're very high quality by a company called Assetto. And one of the questions that Racing Studio asked me was, could you send us some pictures of these in the cockpit area so we could at least see what sort of shapes and things we need in there? And despite them being in 1/18th scale and being pretty small, they were good enough to discern some details on the display. So we've got that. They were good enough to discern detail of the overall size and shape of the steering wheel. So we got that. We got this padding material around the seat. And we also got ourselves some cockpit detail lower down. I didn't have anything that would show this cable in the bottom of the cockpit. But we tried to get pictures of the pedal box. And you can see that we don't have any pedals modeled in here. It was something that we tried hard to find. It was something I remember talking with some members of the Racing Studio team about, because the car had a throttle cable, so there had to have been some sort of a spring linkage or something with the accelerator at very least, but I couldn't really figure out anything with the disposition of the brake and clutch. My 1/18th scale models have pedals in them, but it's really difficult to get a camera down into the cockpit at that close range on such a small object, so ultimately no pedals modeled in this cockpit. But again, that's not something that's unique to this car. Racing Studio have done that a few times in the past, and it's, again, not something that you're ever gonna see, so I think we can excuse them in that regard. But really, we've done ourselves a lot of work on this thing, and again, hats off to CC for putting this model together, and hats off to Domi for the physics and NK for the sounds. As you'll hear later on, they are absolutely remarkable. Crazy amounts of stuff going on here. We can leave Freecam here, and we can go back, take a look in the cockpit proper from more or less our driving position. There we go. This is pretty much the view that you get. I feel like we're sitting slightly off center, but that's fine. Anyway, looking around in the cockpit, as we saw, all the detail you can imagine, it's here. You've got that wonderful padding detail on the seat, which is all done in 3D. That's not just a texture. That is an actual 3D shape. You've got your seat belts. You've got your buckles. You've got all the things you would expect. And then you got this little lever here on the right-hand side. That's not a gear lever, obviously. That is to adjust the front anti-roll bar. And if you hit the space bar, you can actually see that actuating. That is really, really cool. That was an early detail that I remember CC talking about all the way back again in like early 2019, and he wanted this in the car. And there it is. You can see the little pin linkage, or little wire really twisted around the lever to connect the adjuster bar to the lever. You can see that it goes in and out of all of its detents. That is pretty remarkable stuff. It's just basically a gear pawl there. Not all that dissimilar from how an automatic transmission stays in park once you put it in park. That's really, really ridiculous. It doesn't do anything. It's not an in-car adjustment that you can make as you're on track, but I like that detail an awful lot. And again, it doesn't do anything in terms of the functionality of the car as a mod, but it's so cool that they bothered to put that in there. It's ridiculous, and it's awesome. The car also does come stock with a few skins that you can see here. Obviously, you've got this skin, which is, it bears somebody's name. I don't really know who that is, nor do I know who this F-Man guy is on the tires, but we do have it there, and that's really, really cool. And then, of course, we do also have some other skins that we'll have to come back and take a look at because I've lost my cursor. As with any Race Sim Studio car, the car does come preloaded with some generic skins on it. Obviously, we don't want to be reproducing anything that would be 100% one-to-one with the real world because, you know, licensing and things. But we do have a number of preloaded skins here. Obviously, we have got this one, and then we have got some real-world skins that have been made so far, but this is another RSS skin, number 77. And then we've got a yellow one, or two yellow ones. We've got two blue ones. We've got this FW13B Williams skin that I've got here. We've got blue. We've got white. We've got black. We've got chrome. This doesn't really show up in showroom view, but when this is out on track, it is shiny and reflective as hell, and it looks really, really cool. We've got a Lotus skin. We've got the other chrome one. We've got a Life L190 skin from a third party. That's cool. And again, this is not meant to be a comprehensive list of all the skins available third party. People have been releasing them left and right, and they're doing a great job. And we've got a carbon one as well, which is third party. But really, really nice to see that you've got yourself a lot of skins available on this car. And of course, this would be Alain Prost's real world skin. Good. And then you've got this one. These are the names of real people for the most part, or entirely. If you are a member of the Race Sim Studio Discord, and if you're not, I do suggest that you check it out, because always lots of cool discussion going on there. They do, from time to time, when they're getting close to releasing a new car, they do ask people on the Discord for their names and countries and numbers and sometimes even colors that they want. And they will put your name on the car. So that's how I ended up on this one. And that's how I believe anybody else here ended up on these skins as well. So, yeah, if you want your name on a Race Sim Studio car, join the Discord, because every now and again they will ask people to supply numbers and names and even color preferences from time to time, and you might be able to get your name on a car. It's cool. At any rate, though, that's enough showroom time. What does this thing do on track? It does a lot of things on track. There's a lot of performance available, but the way that it brings it to you is not necessarily straightforward all the time. It's a little bit of a learning curve to go into this car, especially because of its age, but its age can be deceiving as well. Again, there's a lot of performance potential available, and the way in which it does it, it's really very comparable to a modern Formula 2 car. So the temporality of things, the chronology of how you would expect the performance to develop over 30 years, it isn't quite as it seems. To do this, we're going to take this thing to Vallelunga, and we'll see you there next. Welcome to Vallelunga. Before we get out on track, of course, a look through the setup screen to show you what's going on here with the RSS Formula 1990 V12. First off, on the gear display, we do have a 7-speed semi-auto gearbox in this car, and we have a full range of adjustment available to us. First through 7th gear, plus the final drive ratio, almost infinitely adjustable default gear set shown here. Tires, we have got a menagerie of tire compounds available, defaults to the medium compound, but we have a hard compound, we have got the medium, we've got a soft, and we do have a qualifying tire as well. The qualifying sessions in this era of Formula 1 were pretty monotonous affairs until things started to tick down to the final few minutes of the session. That's when everybody threw the softest available tires on and just went for it on low tanks. Ayrton Senna getting so many pole positions in this era because he was really good at that one hot lap strategy. But we do have all of those tire compounds available. This livery here, the number 47 F-Man livery, the qualifying tires here have F-Man on them, as you can see. That's pretty cool, I've got to say. Default tire pressures are 15 psi in the front and 14 at the rear. The range of adjustment goes between 10 and 24 psi, and that's on all four. Fuel, we've got it zeroed out to keep the engine quiet, but the maximum fuel capacity is all the way up to 220 liters, so you do have the capacity to put a lot of gas on board. Of course, there was no in-race refueling in this era of Formula 1, so all the fuel you start with is all the fuel you got. Aerodynamics, front and rear wing, the only adjustments we can make here. The angles of attack do not change depending on your setting, but you do have it available, and of course the effects are duly modeled. Brakes, brake bias, and brake power here. Default is 51% to the front. Your maximum disposition to the front can be 61%, and your minimum can be 44%. Drivetrain, this is your differential adjustment in power coast and preload, and you can see the default values here. I prefer to have the differential pretty slack, so I'll wrap all these right down, but default setup, this is what you've got. Alignment, camber, and toe on all four corners, default values shown there. Your main suspension screen here, screen 2, you've got the front anti-roll bar, wheel rates, and ride heights on all four corners. Your third suspension screen, your dampers, these are your fast and slow bound and rebound here on all four corners, your bump stop values here on all four corners, and then that's about it. Your steering assist here defaults to 75%. That's basically the power steering adjustment. You can adjust that to your heart's content. That's more of a force feedback steering weight preference thing. It doesn't really have any impact on car performance. That's about it in terms of the setup screen on this thing. We will return everything to default settings here. 70 liters of fuel on board, and we'll just do a little bit of a shakedown run. First off, of course, though, in the cockpit, we'll shut everything down. You can see now that we have got our car alive here, the ignition is switched on and the dashboard is alive. What have we got going on? Well, you can see the dashboard front and center there between the spokes of the steering wheel. You've got your dash all lit up. First of all, you can see the clock ticking away past 4 minutes. That is our current lap time. Over to the right, as we mentioned in showroom view, you've got your gear position indicator showing R for reverse, but we can go all the way up through the box if we would like. There's neutral, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, back to neutral, and now we'll kill the engine again. We have got our position down in that bottom row, P1. We have our engine RPM there represented digitally, and then we've got our fuel level, 70 liters indicated right now. In the cockpit, though, you can see we have got our steering wheel with our driver arms there modeled nicely, and then that's about all that we've got going on in the cockpit. We will have a Rev Counter that has multiple dispositions, 2 pages really, showing lower and higher revs, and then across the top we'll have shift lights that come up in red, and then they all flash once it's time to change gear. You get up toward the rev limit. We'll get our pedals up here in the lower left of the display so you can see what our inputs are in terms of which gear we're in. You'll be able to see that on the dashboard itself. We've got Vallelunga to ourselves. We're on default setup, medium tires, 70 liters of fuel on board. Let's take a look. Wonderful sounds here of this engine, just off idle. Throw it into first gear, bring the revs up a little bit. And we're rolling. Out of the pit lane and onto the racetrack. I have not had the tires in the warmers. And we are reasonably heavy on fuel, so we'll take a few corners to get temperature up. There's full revs. Jump on the brakes a bit early, start to get temperature into them, get some temperature across the front axle. Bit understeer there on cold tires. Trying to get some heat in the front axle here. Not too many high-speed corners here at Vallelunga, so you really got to work the steering at low speed to start getting heat in them. That works. Through the S at the end of the lap. Final corner called Roma. And to begin our first flyer of the session. These corners here are really the only 2 high-speed corners on a lap. Still working on brake heat. Front axle is starting to get there. All right, the brakes are pretty much there now. There we go. Rears are pretty much there, fronts are pretty much there, the brakes are there. Yep, we're there. We can start to speak representatively about what the car is doing. Now, reasonably heavy on fuel, bit under half a tank here. 66 liters indicated. But what is it doing? First of all, you've got that power behind you, and you can hear that chiming in right up to about 13,000 RPM before the upshift happens. 3.5 liter Ferrari Type 036 V12. It is the most glorious noise that you're ever going to hear in Assetto Corsa, bar none. With the tire temps up, though, what do you got in terms of feedback? Steering weight is not super light, but it's not super heavy. Feels about right. I don't believe the cars had power assist in this era. But the car weighs 500 kilograms. So it's not super heavy. You wouldn't expect it to be super heavy. The steering weight does get a bit higher as the speed increases. Through high-speed corners, the steering weight's really good. Through the medium and low-speed stuff, like most of the lap here, it's very manageable. I like it a lot. In terms of the feedback you get over the bumps, when the tires start to slip a bit, that all feels good enough. Like through here, the steering's reasonably heavy. I like that. Very smooth. With the brakes up to temperature, the brakes grab very nicely, but they don't lock up right away. You do have a lot of mechanical grip. Big slick tires, of course. Of course, cadence braking is necessary in this car. It is very much a wing car. Lots of aerodynamic grip. And of course, downforce squares with speed. So as the speed drops off, the downforce drops off, and you got to start coming off of the brakes from high speed. But generally, you've got a pretty forgiving envelope in terms of braking. Also, generally speaking, in terms of overall balance, the car is biased toward understeer a bit on default. That's expected. Just trying to make it a little bit more accessible, I suppose, in terms of people who just get it and immediately load it up. You don't want to be frustrated straight away. And of course, having a fair amount of fuel on board, it's not quite as twitchy as it could be. The heavier the car gets, the more stable it gets. So as you start running with more and more gas, the car becomes less reactionary. Definitely is heavier and it feels heavier, but it becomes more and more of a stable platform. It's very consistent over longer runs. The tires wear linearly. When you start to do 20, 30 laps at a time, it's very predictable. But as you can see there, you can get the rear axle out if you give it a bit too much power straight away. Understeer there at low speed, that's expected. Not much aero at those speeds. Trail braking is your friend. Let's get the weight over the nose a little bit on the brakes and then just let the axle hook up. Little bit of medium speed oversteer is possible under acceleration.
And it really starts to highlight the, I suppose it's almost a little bit of a contradiction in terms of what the car does. In some respects, it is extremely modern, despite being from 1990. You got the semi-automatic gearbox. You got a very highly digital cockpit in terms of the instrumentation available, and you'd be forgiven for thinking the car is newer than it actually is. In a lot of respects, it drives very much like a more modern one. But when you start to approach the limits, that's when its true lineage and its true age starts to come out. It is 30 years old, and it does drive very much like a car from the mid to late 80s in some regards, particularly with it not being totally planted around high-speed corners. It do have a lot of downforce, but just the way the technology has evolved here, sometimes you can feel that flow, particularly through the undertray and the diffuser, starting to become detached, and then you suddenly lose a lot of the rear downforce, and the thing steps out. But because it does have so much mechanical grip, you can almost always correct it before it becomes too much of a problem. It's actually pretty difficult to spin this car if you don't want to. See what I mean? Just a little bit opposite lock and it comes right back. The front axle is so grippy in situations like that. Most likely because the car is just so light. Again, 500 kilograms with the driver. Into the lower speed corners like these, of course, there will be understeer, but again, is the weight transfer to the front axle. A little bit of a four-wheel drift under braking there, but just use the brakes to get the weight over the front, and it will catch up to itself. One thing you don't want to do, though, is just throw it into corners. That will immediately give understeer, and then because you've already got the weight already transferred over about as far as it can to one side or another, then it won't come back. Then you do have to unwind the steering and take a second bite at the apex. But high speed, stuck, pretty well stuck. Through the transitional zones between low and high speed, though, the diffuser starts to hook up. You can use throttle angle to send more air through the diffuser. Again, with that blown exhaust arrangement, works really nicely, but wonderfully implemented. Go a little wide there. Little dip of the clutch there. That's me doing that. You don't need to use the clutch to use this transmission. On the upshift or downshift, no need to blip the throttle, no need to lift the throttle on the upshift. But sometimes you will see me just dipping the clutch in on some upshifts. I typically do that when I'm upshifting way early in terms of low revs, just to try and avoid wheel spin induced by the upshift. Or if I've got wheel spin on the rear axle and I want to command an upshift, I will just momentarily disconnect the rear axle from the engine via the clutch just to allow that wheel spin to settle down. But a few laps into this run now, the tires are really hooked up. Medium compound, remember, so they've got some life in them. Car feels stable, again biased toward understeer on default setup, but you can get the rear end out with a little kick on the gas, and then it comes right back, provided you correct accordingly. It's wonderfully done. And of course, as the fuel load burns down, provided that you take reasonable care of the tires, the lap times will just fall. A little bit of wheel spin coming out of low speed corner there. Do it again here. Very stable. You don't want to do it too much in a long race stint because you'll wear the tires prematurely, but for here it works pretty well. Look at that, a little bit of a four-wheel power slide. Found a second on that lap, okay. And of course you can just see the car gets lighter and lighter. It starts to get a little bit more unstable as it gets lighter, but the lap times, they just start to fall. The performance comes to you. The tires are consistent. Once you get them warmed up, they will be there. Once you understand what the car's going to do in terms of understeer and oversteer, really the only oversteer problems you get coming back onto the power out of low speed corners. That's basically par for the course in any car, but it's so stable in terms of how it will react to your inputs. No issues whatsoever from the chassis side. It's having a bit of fun sliding it around now. Look at that. Use the throttle just to tweak the rear end around. It's wonderful. Speaking of tweaking the rear end, we just did that. Oops. That's okay. That's absolutely lovely. Yeah, we tweaked the rear a little bit on the concrete wall there, but no visible damage. That's fine by me. But yeah, yes, that's default setup. Not too bad. What was our best lap time? It was a 1:18 and change, I think. Yep, 1:18.655. So, all right, with a reasonable amount of fuel on board, that's what it'll do. Now we can start to play with the setup a bit. Right, so on the question of setup, what can we do here? Well, first of all, on the medium tires, that's going to be a limiting factor no matter what we do, only because, well, you know, the compound can only do so much. But what else would we like to do with this thing? Do we necessarily need all this wing? Not for this track. We really don't have too many high-speed corners, so the ones that we do have, they're basically flat out anyway, so we can take a lot of wing out. Bring the brake bias a bit forward, not too much, but here's really where I'd like to make the adjustments. Get the differential really opened up to its maximum extent even, see what that does. Otherwise, things like the ride height, we can lower that a little bit. Actually lower that a lot a bit. Go 6 clicks down on all 4. Not to change the center of gravity of the car, but to start to generate more downforce that way. The other suspension settings I more or less like. A little bit, maybe a bit softer on the anti-roll bar to try and get us around this track a bit better. Again, the medium to low speed corners where weight transfer is really important. We can use those front tires a little bit more effectively, I think, because we are getting some low speed understeer. Then in terms of our fuel load, obviously we can get it lower than this, but without changing anything else too drastically on the setup and using the medium tires, what can we do? We can lower the pressures a bit. Not so much, perhaps. Gotta get our ride height within legal limits, of course. So that's fine. That is right on the edge of being legal to go out of the pits, but we can do that. And, yeah. Seems about right. We'll see what that does. Bring our pedals back up. There we go. All right. What have we here? High-speed stability is fine. Get some heat in the brakes. Get some heat in the tires. There's that oversteer on cold tires. With the differential being opened up like this, the rear end will be a little bit more squirrely, particularly now that the tires are cold. So we will have to bring that up in terms of the temperatures. But high-speed stability is fine. Little bit of oversteer starting to settle in there. See what this will do. A little bit of wheel spin there on corner exit. Bit of understeer into neutral oversteer. Let's see what we do on 67 liters of fuel. Straight line speed is a bit enhanced due to running less wing. Oversteer on turn in, gotta watch that. Neutral four-wheel drift under braking. Perhaps the brake bias is a little bit too far forward. We'll wrap that back a little. Back down. Front tire's getting overwhelmed. Really got to get that moment of inertia done before you turn into the corner, otherwise it will become a little unstable. One 162. 314 kilometers an hour before jumping onto brakes. Bit of a step out under braking. We go a bit wide. Get the weight transferred, get it settled, and then turn in. You will get oversteer on power application with the diff being this open. Not bad. Not bad at all. Have we found time? I don't really feel like it. Let's see. Not really. We did go off at turn 1, or really turn 3 if you want to be technical. Let's see. Got the nose in that time. A little bit of power oversteer on the upshift. One of the reasons, again, why you might want to cut in the clutch on some of these upshifts in low gears. A little bit of weight transfer going a little bit nuts there. No problem. Here we go. Into first gear, get it stopped, then turn it in hard. You can do it that way. Second gear, turn it in. On the throttle. First gear, pretty wide on the entrance. Tuck in. Get it out over the exit curbs, that's fine. You can use the exit curbs there, it's no problem. You can turn in off of them. The camber actually is a bit positive, it'll help you turn in. Second gear through the final corner on the throttle. That lap definitely was better at 1:18.544. Second gear, get it in. That's good. I'll take that. Trying to go for a later apex, which I guess we still sort of did, but oversteer on turn in there. So definitely with a little bit of aero and differential adjustments, you can take the car from understeer to oversteer pretty quickly. And this Vallelunga circuit is really a challenge for the chassis dynamics of anything. We completely messed that up there. That's entirely my fault. And of course, pretty narrow track, no room to turn around. But so many varied angles of attack in terms of your approach to a corner and what the weight transfer does to the big braking zones as you transition from braking to turning in. The car will twitch quite a bit, as you can see. And that really is the instructional portion of the chassis dynamics of this thing. I've driven cars very much like this. Flat bottom, naturally aspirated, decent power mid-range, but as you can see, there's a lot of learning that can still happen in a car like this. I think we've scorched the tires a bit. Kind of cooled them down a little bit toward the end of the lap. Let's see what this does. And holding the brake a little bit longer with the trail braking there, just trying to keep that weight over the front axle until we really properly turn in. You can still see the oversteer comes in. You do have to be ready to react. Even at low speed like that, that was basically full opposite lock. Definitely a class in weight transfer and chassis dynamics. And in our first run, we remarked that the heavier the car gets, the more stable it gets. Well, it appears that the same is true in inverse proportion in terms of it getting lighter. The lighter the car gets, the more unstable it may become. Which in my opinion is a very good thing, because cars of this era, and basically cars all the way up through the late 2000s, they were light, they were a bit skatey, the drivers needed to be on top of them, they needed to be ready to react, and they also needed to anticipate the car breaking free. And that's where the driver's skill starts to come into the equation. If you ask me, the modern complexion of Grand Prix racing has way too much downforce, way too much mechanical grip. Even though it's not at all easy to drive those cars, it looks way too easy. There's a lot to be said in the shock and awe value of some of these guys going sideways at 180 miles an hour. And that's something that we just don't see today. Getting the car stopped, turning it in, late apex. Get on the throttle, feed it in for the exit, that's better. You really do have to get the car stopped before you try to turn it in. And the reason for all of that, in terms of the car really only wanting to do one thing at a time, goes back to the concept of a tire and the traction envelope. The tire can only do so many things. It can make you go, it can make you stop, and it can make you turn. But it can only do those three things in some proportion relative to the other variables before it runs out of steam. Everything that you put through a tire in terms of loading, be it lateral or longitudinal, eventually it hits a threshold of where it can't put up with it anymore. And as you start to combine inputs, the tire has an overall reduced tolerance for each one in isolation. And that's what this car really does drive home. You've got to stay within the limits of the tire. You've got to stay within the limits of the chassis in terms of weight transfer, in terms of what it can and cannot do. You do that, and it's stuck. You try to step beyond it, and as we've seen a couple of times on this run, it will just break away from you, and not always can you recover. Not bad though, mid 118s, that's okay. Using all the road on the approach here. And then feed the throttle in. Engine is not very peaky. Of course, it's hitting maximum power right toward the top of the rev range, but the torque comes in reasonably low, about low mid RPM. I'd say around 8,000 is where the torque starts to come in, and then it stays fairly consistent all the way up to red line. You can balance the car on the throttle very effectively. And of course, the gearbox is a peach at high speed. Medium speed can be a little bit clunky. Although this is a semi-automatic gearbox, it is not by any means seamless. Again, this is basically the infancy of semi-auto technology. The upshifts are not instantaneous. There is a discernible break in drive on the upshifts. And the downshifts, of course, there is a bit of a gap between the gear being disengaged. There's a blip to do a rev match. The engine does that automatically. And then the next gear down comes in, and sometimes that can give you a little bit of rear instability. But if you just start to become receptive to the traction envelope in terms of what the tires can and cannot do, in terms of what the car can and cannot do, especially at mid-corner in terms of maintaining stability, it will come to you. Your brain will make the adjustment, and then you're just off. And you will go and go and go until you don't want to go no more. Well, box. We will try not to run into the wall this time. All right. All right, so you can make some reasonably minor setup changes, and then suddenly you will start to see the lap time starting to come down. And again, it's very accessible. It will respond to changes in lap time like you would expect in terms of changes in setup. Getting a little bit quicker here. But of course, we do have qualifying tires available, and that is really where the car is going to start to get into its element and deliver that ultimate one-lap pace. Let's see what that does. Right, so no holds barred. Qualifying tires on board. Got the pressures right down. We will run just barely enough fuel to do an outlap, an inlap, and 2 flyers. And we'll see what the performance envelope really is. We'll declutter down, get the pedals back, and see what it'll do. Now, these qualifying tires are really soft, and they really are only designed to do one really quick lap. So the outlap has basically got to be spent at reduced pace, being really careful not to slide the tires around too much so that you don't knock the new out of them too soon. But at the same time, you got to get some heat into them. and you do very much got to get heated to the brakes. So it's a delicate balance of making sure you've got enough temperature versus trying to maintain the tire's integrity. And of course on the outlap you do want to be burning some fuel off, just to get a little bit more weight out of the car. The high-speed corner will get some heat into them real nice. Now we start to wind up. And now we just start to go for it, see what it'll do. All right, off we go. 19 liters of fuel indicated. Braking pretty deep into really turn 3. Plenty of grip across the rear axle now. Car still understeering a little bit toward the apex. There's that neutral slide. Little bit too much speed carried in through there. Not the best lap I've ever done. But there it is, 1:15.469, I believe. So immediately a few seconds faster than we've got so far. We are really carrying still a little bit too much fuel. Bit of a lock up there, just stay in it because you got to get the car stopped, and that's okay. Those low speed lockups don't hurt you all that much. Carry a bit less speed so we actually make it to the apex. Here's the curb on the exit. Get it in. (1:15.389). And now the tires will have lost all the new. Yep. It could do that on the previous lap, but not this one. That's what I mean. They're really only good for one quick lap. If you really take care of them on the outlap, they might hold on for a second, but the third is not going to happen. And now that we've had our spin, the grip is really gone. I'm just trying to slide the thing around now. Obviously, it has varying degrees of success. But that's what it can do in a more qualifying, focused setup. We can still afford to take some more gas out of it. So you can see, we could just run with 10 liters if we want. Put in 12 just to be absolutely safe. Take out some of this wing. And the tire pressures felt okay. Can we improve on a 115 and change? Let's find out. Of course, we got to start the warm-up all over again. On the brakes. Pretty good. Not knock the new out of him too soon. Good grip. There's our fuel light at 10 liters. See what it'll do. 10 liters, 9 liters across the line. Little bit of oversteer on turn in, you just correct it. Headed into the apex, feed the throttle in, let the back come around. But 15.7, no quicker. Our third gear through here. Oh, short shift into fourth. And it turned in. On the throttle. First gear, trying to get it stopped in a turn. Again, that understeer into neutral oversteer, rearing its ugly head into the lower speed stuff. Get the nose in. That was very sideways. I think we lost any advantage that we had. Tires are just going off. Again, they are really only meant for one flyer. Yep, almost identical times there. Bit of a four-wheel drift all the way around the corner, though. Start to do that once the tires start to wear. And if you control it correctly, you can hold it around an entire corner. That is not controlling it correctly. So yeah, the end lap, just having a little bit of fun. 2 liters of fuel left. But that, generally speaking, is what the car will do in a qualifying configuration. Bit quicker. We found, what did we find? 17, 16, 15, about 3.5 seconds a lap there, just by changing the tires and, basically running, actually the first run here we were running a little bit more wing, but yeah, there's about 3 seconds a lap to be found between the medium and the qualifying tire, so there's that level of performance potential as well in this thing, and that's also indicative of what you would have gotten in 1990 in these qualifying sessions with the bespoke qualifying tires that the teams would just throw on the cars and then use them up and then throw them away because they had 18,000 more sets of them just waiting. But that's how qualifying used to be, and unlike in the turbo era where they would just close down the wastegates and all of a sudden the car had another 500 horsepower relative to the last practice session, not so much of a change there in terms of overall power, but in terms of the mechanical grip available, yeah, really, really big differences can be made just by swapping tires around. And now, to close us out here at Vallelunga, I've been mentioning the other RSS Halo car that we have had in recent years. This one, the RSS Formula 2000 V10, seen here in a third-party Jordan livery. Looks really good, I must say. But this car was released in late 2018, Christmas Day 2018. We got this one, and to date, I think it is still the most impressive car ever released by RaceSim Studio. However, does it have a worthy stablemate in the RSS Formula 1990 V12? I think it does. We've got 4 laps here in a sprint race, head-to-head, 100% on the AI strength. Neither one of us has tire warmers. We've both got our softest possible tires fitted. Let's see how this shakes out. And we're off. We get a better purchase off the line thanks to our slicks. And I think we've taken him. Gotta be careful here, because our tires are cold. He is behind us pretty close. Now remember, he has about 120 more horsepower than we do, so surely he's going to have an advantage down the straights, but we weigh about 100 kilograms less than he does. And we've got a wider suspension track, and we have slick tires. He's got grooves. We're lighter, which means we'll accelerate a little bit quicker out of the corners. It also means that we might be able to brake a little bit later, despite his brakes being better. He is trying to send it up the inside. We have got understeer again, still trying to get the tires warmed up. We lock it up, hitting into the hairpin. But we're just able to get that purchase out of the tarmac a little bit more quickly than he is, thanks to our slick tires. He is still hanging with us, though. He's got the straight line speed advantage thanks to his horsepower, remember. He is looking all over the back of us. He sends it up the outside, and he's going to go wide. He's going to cut across the front of us. That was very dirty from him. And you can see how he is able to pull away. We can brake later, though, and we start to get him under braking. The initial acceleration, we hang with him, but then he has 120 more horsepower than we do. We all try to catch him, or is this going to be a losing battle? Right here down the straights, that's where he's got all of his advantage. And you can see the effect of that. He's able to pull away almost the entire length of the straight. Does not look like we've got an answer for him, folks. Despite us being lighter, despite us having more mechanical grip, he's just too quick, he's got too much horsepower, and he's left us in the dust. Look at that. It's not even in our field of view anymore. I'm giving it all it's got. It doesn't have enough. He got past us by somewhat of a dirty move. He sent it up the inside. He went off. He cut us off when he rejoined the track, and then he was gone. So he's crossed the line. And now we have crossed the line. And there's about the size of it. 5:05.531 versus 5:12.701, 7.17 seconds. You can see that the per lap pace, we managed a 1:16.262. He did a 1:13.914. Again, Sector 1 is all straight lines here, so despite us, in theory, having the better car for the corners, he has the better car for the straight simply because, well, he has 805 horsepower and we have 680. Oh well, We kept him behind us for the first lap, though, and we did get a better start off the line because we've got slicks and he's got grooves. But once he had those tires up to temperature and once he was able to go for a gap and then he had clear air, gone. No contest in it whatsoever. But I do have to say, it's maybe a little bit closer than you might think. I mean, to be 3 seconds a lap, basically 3 seconds a lap slower on the fastest lap, that's, well, not so great, I suppose, if you want to talk about just raw relative pace, but 10 years between these cars, completely different regulations, completely different drivetrain arrangements, with the exception of the 7-speed semi-automatic gearbox, but he's got a V10, we've got a V12. He's 1,800 millimeters, we're 2 meters, about a little bit more than 2 meters wide. 3 seconds over 10 years ain't all that much, all things considered. We have seen Formula One make changes like that in lap times from 1 year to the next, so over 10? Food for thought, I must say. At any rate, though, that is going to bring this voluminous review of the RSS Formula 1990 V12 to a close. I do highly recommend that you take a look at this car at the Race Sim Studio website, link to their website in the description here, and give this thing a go, because this is definitely one of the best cars ever released by Race Sim Studio. Therefore, it makes it one of the best cars ever released for sim racing, full stop. It is such a rewarding and technical experience. It's a challenging one, and even for somebody like me who's been doing this for a long time, I have still a lot to learn, and this car can be teaching me a lot of those things. So, again, an absolutely fantastic project by Race Sim Studio. It's taken them the better part of 2 years to complete, and now that it is here, it really completes one of my dreams in sim racing, to drive a very good reproduction of the Ferrari 641, the first truly successful semi-automatic Formula One car with a V12 engine in the back. It sounds great, it goes great, it looks great. Infinite replay value in this. It's a wonderful addition to Assetto Corsa. It's a wonderful addition to your Assetto Corsa lineup if you don't have it already. You need this thing, and you will not at all be sorry that you decided to pull the trigger on it. Hot laps here at Vallelunga are to come for your viewing pleasure without commentary, so you can hear the V12 at full song. Stay tuned for those hot laps, everyone. And until next time, Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you so very much for watching, and of course, we will see you soon.